Hey there, Squirrel Army. How's it going today? We are discussing going outside of the EDH checklist. Alright, so for those people, just quickly, who are not too familiar with what the EDH checklist or the default EDH checklist is, that is just saying have enough mana rocks, have enough lands, and have enough card draw, and have enough removal to kind of get through the game. And the suggested number of those, cards in each category, the number of lands is usually about 38. The number of ramp spells is about 10. Same with card draw. And the amount of removal is about 7, I would say, nowadays. 5 to 7. Depending. But anyway, that doesn't really count board wipes, I don't think. But still, like, those do come into removal as well, I guess. So, but still, the idea is there that you've got this checklist of saying you've got 38 lands, you've got 10 ramp and 10 card draw, and you've got, 6 or so pieces of, single target removal, to, make sure that, you don't just auto lose games, you don't just like fall too far behind people, and, you don't sort of run out of gas too quickly. Certain decks and certain colors are obviously better at card draw, and certain colors are obviously better at ramp. Although, funnily enough, they decided to give green a whole bunch of card draw in the last few years and whatnot. So now green basically has everything except for removal, though it has Beast Within, but that's, like, pretty bad. And it has, like, Nature's Claim, which is pretty good, but that's kind of about it, like, realistically, as far as, like, removal goes in its color pie, or part of the color pie. But anyway, like, we're discussing going outside of that range, and that's not a bad thing to do, because every deck is its own deck. Like, if I have a 2-drop commander, and my commander happens to make mana, or happens to help the rest of my deck make mana, or basically the rest of my deck, as long as I'm built around it, make mana, then, like, I have a very reliable source of ramp right there in my command zone. So I don't really need to run as many lands, and I don't really need to run as much other ramp either. Not that I can get away with running none, but I can get away with running a whole lot less, because I'm 9 times out of 10 going to get my commander on turn 2 anyway, and that means that I have access to that ramp. Now, not every commander is like that, but I'm just saying, for example, that is a deck that doesn't need as many lands, because, well, all I need to do is get to 2 mana, and I'm already starting to ramp. Not that I can run, 30 lands or whatever. That's just silly, but at a certain point, you can start going, well, yes, I don't really need to run 38 lands in this deck, and I don't really need to run 10 other mana dorks or mana rocks or mana producing sources, because my commander is such a source of ramp, and almost every other card that's in my deck is now a ramp spell as well. So now every spell is even more powerful than what it is, because now it's a ramp spell. I have that Simic deck that's a, 4-mana commander that makes everything a mana dork. Now, I want more mana dorks in that deck, because you want to ramp into your commander, because it's 4 mana, not 2 mana like my other commander that I just stated before. And I probably want a little bit more lands in that deck. But after that, maybe I don't want as much ramp. But because that commander also makes everything ramp or make mana, it's pretty good. But that commander really wants to be making extra mana with your other mana dorks. So those other mana dorks and things like that you have in that deck isn't there specifically so much to ramp per se. although it is, in a sense, it's ramping more for what it is as a utility creature. It's not just a mana dork that produces 1 mana. It's a mana dork that produces 2 mana or more. So that's where I want those to be at. I want those other sources of ramp to ramp more than just the 1 or whatever, the generic default of usually ramping for 1, so that I can get extra value out of, playing my game plan and getting along and getting the cards that I want to get in out of that deck onto the field. So again, but most of that commander as well provides a source of card draw. But that's not to say that in that deck I want less card draw. In fact, I want as much as possible for the most part, because again, I need to dig down to find, a way to win. So just having more card draw does not hurt me in that deck, though there wouldn't be many decks that I would say that you don't want, to a degree, more card draw in, because card draw is always good, even if your commander is a source of card draw or card advantage. I have my 4-color deck, which has one of the commanders that, when it enters, everyone investigates or gets to investigate. I always investigate, and if my opponents investigate, I get to get an extra clue token. So that helps me draw a whole bunch of cards, and I don't really need to do much more with it. I just need to get those clues out pretty early on and just draw cards. And I don't really care if my opponents don't take the cards or don't take the clues, because at the end of the day, I'm just going to, get what I wanted out of it anyway. I'm going to make them lose life or whatever. So it doesn't really affect me either way. So, like I say, it's one of those things. So it does depend on what your deck is doing. And that's one of those things, and we might have to say this more towards in another episode here, is that this is one of those things. It's always so tough because there's so many different decks and so many different strategies. You can give good generic advice, I would think, sometimes, but that generic advice doesn't really represent a lot of, the decks that are outlying decks. And nearly every deck that's actually, somewhat interesting or a build around or whatever is one of those outlying decks. So it's just well, how am I, meant to take this advice? But it's tough to give advice to every single deck, because there's a lot of decks out there, and they're always printing more and more and more cards for this format. So it's just one of those things. You cannot possibly talk about every single card and every single set and every single thing. And that's why a lot of cards get sort of swept under the rug, because they weren't perhaps as enthralling or whatever as something else that was in the set. Or it does depend on what your, I guess your personality to a degree is. If you're a more spiky leading person and you prefer combos and, tutoring and that sort of thing or whatnot, that style of play, then a card that's a very powerful, creature or something, unless it's a literal, really good value engine or whatever, perhaps, you might not look at that and think that that's such an amazing card. But to a player like me, who's much more focused on aggro strategies, then that's a really great card, because, that's what I'm more interested in. I'm much more interested in that aggro strategy or that defensive, strategy that might bring. And that's another point to sort of bring forth. Again, not every deck that isn't green always wants mana rocks, because it's we want to do other things. And treasures are a way to kind of get around that, but they are an artifact as well, I guess. So it's one of those things. But again, there's a lot of there's actually a few commanders that are a bit weird that deal with like landfalls and things like that, or land plays, or just things like that aren't in green. And it's like, well, that's a really weird kind of command or a really weird strategy, but it is a really like worthwhile strategy in a lot of ways, because again, it depends what you're doing. So like just saying, oh, I'm going to jam in, these, 10 good mana rocks into my deck that actually isn't in green and actually cares about landfall. Well, that's probably not the best plan, because again, you probably want to be getting those lands consistently and multiple lands per turn to trigger those other effects. So just saying that I'm going to run a whole bunch of mana rocks isn't really going to really do that for you. Now, there aren't a lot of ways to do the land ramping effect, and a lot of them are very expensive. But again, if you really need it, then perhaps you'll need to just invest in that kind of strategy to actually get to that point of being like, okay, I can actually make my very strange strategy that is kind of off the wall and doesn't go into a lot of other decks work. And even some other decks that aren't those strategies, you might want to think about employing some of those other effects, because again, we all know how fragile mana rocks are. Yes, creatures are very fragile as well, but again, I said this before, but creatures can defend. Creatures can get in for offense, and again, even if I've, sitting there with my janky mana dork, and no one bats an eye at me sitting there with my little mana dork on turn 2 or whatever, but as soon as they go to their turn, now, well, what's this? Adam's got a blocker. Well, I guess I'm not attacking him because it's not a free attack. Like, I could chump with my mana dork. I probably wouldn't, but like people just see that as like, well, that's too big of a risk or something or whatever, especially if that mana dork doesn't have summoning sickness or something like that. Like, wait, what's this? Plus I've got like a mana open potentially. Well, I'm not attacking into that. Like he could have Swords of Plowshares, he could have anything. So again, it does depend on what state it's in currently, but again, like you don't have to always take those like numbers exactly. Like I know there's a lot of numbers out there, and some people suggest, like 50 mana or whatever, like a 37 land to 13 ramp split, which isn't bad. Like I don't believe in a 50 mana split because it's just one of those things. I wouldn't say that having 13 ramp spells is horrible, but I just think having like that much ramp or that much mana actually does a whole lot later on in the game, which is one of those things. Like that's why I cut down a little bit on lands. Like the decks that aren't in green, I usually cut them down by. I usually cut the lands that are in green down by at least 1 or 2 lands because they're in green. So they don't really need as many lands unless I'm playing landfall, which I'm not. But again, like they don't need as many lands to function because I'm going to have my mana dorks and I'm going to have my other ramp effects anyway. So I don't really need those that many lands to actually be functioning, even though I get very unlucky from time to time, as I often do say here and there, about getting my lands and whatnot. It's one of those things. It just happens. And another time, I'll get 30 lands in 2 seconds. Like, again, like, it's one of those things. It'll just happen. Like, again, like, people think that's a meme or whatever, and it is to a degree, because obviously I don't get 30 lands in 2 minutes, but whatever. Like that kind of thing does happen where I just like, okay, I just drew, a whole bunch of lands for the last like 6 or 7 or 8, 10 turns or whatever it is, and didn't really draw anything else. And that was all I did. Like, okay, cool. My game's over because I just drew bricks, I had a whole bunch of mana, but that was it. Like, or I had no mana and that was it. So, like, or somebody, again, like, you can get unlucky and somebody can kill your, your turn 2 mana dork, your turn 2 mana rock, or whatever else you've got. Or again, try to call that bluff of, like, I'm going to attack you. And 9 times out of 10, it probably just won't block anyway. But still, like, that threat of having that creature there a lot of the time really does help. Like, especially, like, Knight of the White Orchid, things like that have already kind of done their job and whatnot. Like, it's already gotten me the land, so I don't really care about the rest. Now it's just a 2/2 double first striker sitting there on the field. Like, if I'm a blink deck, then maybe I care about it to a small extent. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy to, chump with that thing and let it die because it's already given me the value that I kind of want or whatever. So I'm not really too sad about, like, losing it at this point. Again, in early turns, you can probably take a few damage here and there, and that's probably fine from your opponents attacking you. And whatnot. You can use your, shock lands or your fetch lands or whatever else as the game goes later. And I know that this is a bit different with CEH and the higher powers and whatnot, that sort of thing. But you can't afford, unless you're gaining a lot of life, to take that much more damage as the game progresses. So you can't really use fetch lands or shock lands or whatnot, that sort of style of stuff anymore, or as much as you were. You've got to value a lot more of your life points because that's what's going to end the game for the most part 9 times out of 10, because that's one of the smallest resources that you have in the game, and it does get dwindled very, very quickly, and a lot quicker than I think some people give credit to when they're playing in the sort of casual metagames of, like, oh, well, they're just turning creatures sideways, that's no big deal. Yeah, until they're, like, you just got attacked for 10, and then you just got attacked for 10 again, and then you just got attacked for 10 again, whatever it is. You got attacked for 5, then you got attacked for 5 again, and then you got attacked for 5 again. It's only been 3 turns, and you've already taken 15 damage. In another turn, you'll have taken 20 damage. Half your life is gone in 4 turns. In 4 more turns, your entire life will be gone. So, like, people scoff at, the aggro strategies and whatnot, and that sort of thing, but they do the job if you're not ready for them, so. But anyway, just getting outside of playing those, like, checklists and saying, well, do I have this? Do I have that? Or, like, looking through your deck and going, like, I do this all the time, as I sort of say. Anytime that I sit there and go, Jesus, I never drew a land and whatnot, but then I'll turn around and go, well, yeah, but if I add any more lands there or whatever, then, it doesn't really help me, because at any game that I could go into next, I could just draw 30 lands, whatever. Like I say, like, it's your deck is super inconsistent. It doesn't matter really what you do or how you shuffle, like, and that sort of thing. Your deck is an inconsistent thing, unless you've got a lot of tutors or a lot more sort of consistency baked into your deck, which a lot of, like, more casual and whatnot newer players don't tend to have. So, like, in saying that I'm going to go outside the bounds of what my deck isn't a bad thing, because, hey, I want to not just play these dead lands later on in the game for the most part. I actually want to draw spells, and I actually want to get gas. Now, whether that's actually going to happen is another thing, but I'm trying to mitigate that in the later game. But obviously it hurts in the early game when you don't get your lands or don't get your ramp or whatnot, whatever, because at that point you're pretty much out of the game anyway, especially when you do just draw those lands much later in the game, and then you're like, well, I could have used this 6 turns ago, but not now. Or, well, yes, I can use it now, but it's way, way, way too late for me to be getting just lands now. Like, no, this isn't really going to help me now. Like, I've already gone past the point at which these would be as useful as what they would have, could have been. Like, so now I just want, you know, something that gives me, like, almost all the lands that I missed out of my deck or whatever. Or I need that much more ability to get more, mana dorks or whatever onto the field so that I can actually deploy my bigger threats and whatnot out and do whatever else I was trying to do and that sort of thing. So again, it's a bit different. And again, like, removal is probably like the one of the least important ones, I would say. That, like, I always say like six or so nowadays, and whatnot, 6 or 7, single target removal. That's where I want to be at. But like, it's one of the least important, I think. Like, that there, like, you don't want to not run removal, but like, you don't need to think about that, like, removal. Like, removal is just there. Like, you're not going to not want it at some point. That's one of those things. Like, I hate having dead cards in my hand, and that's why having flexible cards is really good. But the thing about a lot of flexible cards is their mana cost, and the thing is, especially for single target removal, you want to be shaving those mana costs down. I don't want to play 3 mana for my removal spell, because what if my opponent has ward or whatever, that sort of thing? Well, now it's an additional mana, so now it's 4 mana or whatever. Yes, if I'm playing a 1 mana spell, now it's 2 mana. If I'm playing a 2 mana spell, now it's 3 or whatever. But like, that's way better than me playing a 3 mana spell. And yes, that 3 mana spell might be a little bit more like versatile in some ways, but for the most part, like, the quantities or qualities of most decks fall into, 3 or 4 categories: lands, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, and maybe planeswalkers. So that's pretty much it. So, like, there are other types, obviously, but for the most part, like battles, the most part, they just don't matter 9 times out of 10, because there's so few of those other sorts of types and whatnot that are out there. So you're just not going to come across them that are permanents that are going to be on the battlefield or whatnot, whatever. So, yeah, and like, the number one permanent type in Magic is creatures, no matter the metagame. If you're playing regular Commander, just casual, or CDH, like, creatures are the number one permanent type. And then it's artifacts, I think. And I think besides lands, because obviously lands, but still, like, in CDH, people barely run any lands or whatever. But like, then it's like artifacts, and then it's like enchantments, I think, and then maybe planeswalkers. Planeswalkers are usually the lowest permanent type, because there's so few planeswalkers that generate enough value for the mana cost and whatnot. And like, I almost never put planeswalkers in decks. Like, I have one deck that has a couple of planeswalkers in it, but like, I've been looking at it and I'm going, maybe I should just take them out. I don't know. So it's tough, but like, the two of the effects that are on the planeswalkers or whatever are effects that I want to use or are useful. So just like, yeah, that's fine, whatever. I'm going to keep doing this because my deck kind of wants to do that. And, I've looked at it and thought, well, there's not much else that I can kind of put in there. And that's sometimes like just the strategy or whatever. And again, you should always be looking at your strategy and going, well, what works with my strategy, or what gives me the most advantage? And you don't want to be just like getting one thing out of something per turn, like, Phyrexian Arena or whatever. Things like that. Like, that's pretty bad. Like, I think a lot of people don't love Sylvan Library, but because it basically just gives you one thing out of it. But the thing is, like, it doesn't, but it does, but it sort of lets you scry as well. So that inherent information can be really, really powerful. And just getting what you want on the top to draw or whatever into your hand from that draw can be really powerful, especially if you're me, who's sitting there and going, Jesus Christ, I need my third land. Just being able to scry 3 down to find my land, hopefully, is something that I might want. But, like, I don't know, like, again, the idea of, I don't know, like, putting that in a deck, it can't just be in a deck. Like, to me, it has to have other branching synergies to me. Like, so I'm always like going, this would be an alright card, but I don't know because it doesn't really do anything else. So I've got to already be built around drawing either multiple cards, life gain, life loss, that sort of thing. So, like, that's always the way for me. I always look at things in terms of synergy because I think that's where, like, you find yourself, like, knowing that you're actually on track and actually doing the thing that you're you're on the same thing. You're not just like, or whatever. You're doing things that your deck actually wants to be doing, not just playing cards and crossing fingers and hoping that they resolve or that they stick around for more than a turn or two. Because again, like, I can have cards that I play sometimes on turn 6 or whatever it is because I've been not hitting my third land drop for freaking 4 or 5 turns or whatever it is. And then be like, okay, cool, I play my 3-drop mana dork or whatever I did, or paid my 3-drop mana rock or whatever, and then it immediately gets blown up or whatever, just because somebody else is playing a whole bunch of mana rocks, or just because somebody is like, I don't want you to play the game, Adam, or whatever. And I'm like, screw you, but, all right, whatever. Whatnot, that sort of thing. But still, it's just one of those things you can't really control sometimes. But then, gone to my turn and gone, well, I'll just play another 3-drop mana rock or whatever, 3-drop play. Oh, plus I'll play a land or whatever happens. Like, I'm still playing for that next turn. Like, I'm not going and sitting there and going, oh man, now I can't do anything unless I can't do anything. Like, I'm always going, well, what can I do in trying to evaluate everything as it sort of progresses and going, well, I hope I top deck something, unless I already know what the top card is. Then it's like, well, I know what that top card is, but what's below that? Because if I can cast something from my library, that might get me back into this game, or might get me, doing something else, or, again, maybe I can store some mana away and pay for this ability and, whatnot, and we'll see how I go. But, you never know. But again, just not having to be bound by that template or whatever is one of those things that's a real level up moment for a lot of people, and going, you know what, my Kozilek deck that has, a 10 mana commander or whatever sitting there in the command zone, it probably wants a lot more big ramp than what, I don't know, Lonus, which is a 2-mana commander, would want. Lonus would probably want, like, smaller investments on creatures, like, so that wouldn't, like, really work for a deck like Lonus. And the mana dorks definitely won't work for Kozilek. But again, like, if there were colorless mana dorks at 1 mana in colorless or whatever, then I would still think that Kozilek probably wouldn't 100% want them. But maybe, who knows? But still, it's just one of those things where you look at that and kind of go, well, I need to get my thing out, before anyone's expecting it to come out. So running those mana rocks that kind of produce more mana than what you kind of put in kind of do work well. I'm not a huge fan of them in other decks, but like in decks that have a very big commander that kind of does something, yeah, they're all right. But again, like I think like once you like sit down at a table and you play like reveal that you're playing Kozilek or whatever else that you're playing, some big, 6 or 7 drop commander, like it's got to be a really good commander to be like the commander in a lot of ways. Like you can't just play a commander that's sort of a do nothing spell basically, because like at turn 7-8, that's where people are starting to really hum and starting to really get going and starting to look at closing down the game in the next like 4 to 6 turns or so, or whatever else it is. So like, and there is a big difference between like those 4 to 6 turns from where they are now, certainly, and anything can kind of happen in those 4 to 6 turns. So like you want your commander to come down on 5 before they're really getting set up to sort of like get to their like next step and get to being much more powerful than what your commander can kind of provide. And again, you want haste. You really, really want your commander to have haste, or have to do something straight away, because otherwise, like, what are you spending that mana on? And again, like, if somebody casts a 7 mana spell, usually that wins them the game for the most part. Like in the games that I play, most people don't hardly ever play like a 7 mana spell. Like people will play like 2, 3 drops and a 1 drop, and having used 7 mana, but have not cast a 7 drop spell. So like most of the time you don't see that sort of thing for the most part, unless you're a big mana deck sort of thing, and that's kind of typical where you're going to cast, you're making so much mana and you're going to cast 6 and 7 drops and 8 drops every turn or whatever, or a couple of 8 drops every turn, whatnot, that sort of thing, because that's just not a normal thing for most decks to kind of do. So you really want those cards to either be, again, played at flash speed, so again that they will come down with effective haste, or have effective haste in some other way by having Greaves or a haste enabler, a mass haste enabler, so that you can get that immediately value out of them, because otherwise, again, you're just playing this 6, 7, 8 mana spell, and if other people are, getting towards that playing a 6, 7, 8 mana spell, well, they're probably winning the game, and you're definitely not winning the game. You're just trying to get to your 8 and more 8 and 9 drop spells so that you can get a critical mass of big, powerful things and whatnot and that sort of thing. So it does really depend, but that's just one of those things that it always depends, and it's one of those things you've got to look at. Why are you doing what you're doing, and have that little bit of self-analysis or deck self-analysis. Why am I running 35 lands or 34 lands or whatever else it is? Well, my commander's a 2-drop commander and it makes mana, and it effectively means that my whole deck makes mana effectively because I'm built around it. So again, that means that I can get away with running fewer lands. Also, the other thing is, as I said, my commander makes nearly everything in my deck a mana dork. So therefore, again, same argument. I don't need to run as much other ramp, not none, but I don't need to run much other ramp in that deck. If I want to run cards that make extra mana or provide me with other effects that I kind of want, then yeah, sure, I'll run those, but I won't be just running cards willy-nilly because they're there and they exist. I'll be running those cards because, it actually is along with the strategy and really helps the deck function and do what I want it to do. So always just having those moments to be like, cool, I have thought about this. And again, being intentional. This was intentional. This was by design. You can't be by design like when you don't draw your third land on turn 6 or 7 or whatever else it is. But you can be intentional in being like, well, I at least know that my deck has the right ratios of things, but I just never seem to draw the goddamn things at the right goddamn time, which is just one of those, like, things about Magic. So, but that is pretty much it for this one. You guys can let me know what you guys think about all of this, writing your thoughts down there in the comments below. I hope you've enjoyed, and hope you will join me again in another one.